Well, we are talking about biblical scholar Bart Ehrman, and a lot of his books are very popular right now, and a lot of them on the New York Times bestseller list. And one of the things he calls into question with the Gospels, or one of the reasons he calls the Gospels into question, is because he argues, Mike, that the time frames just don't match up. That when those books were actually written, the supposed eyewitnesses couldn't have survived that long, so they couldn't have been eyewitnesses. Well, first let's start with, how do biblical scholars go about determining when something was written? How do they kind of pin down the time frame?
Fair question. You know, first thing they probably look at is, are there any reports about when they were written? And Papias, I mentioned his name a little earlier, around 120, 125, he mentions that Matthew wrote his gospel while Peter and Paul were setting up churches. So that would have been during the lifetime of some of these major apostles. And Peter and Paul are both believed to have been executed around 64, 65, within 34, 35 years after Jesus' death. So that would have been Matthew before that, if Papias is correct on that. So that would be one thing. We do know, I mean, a lot of people have questioned Papias' testimony, and you know, it's not an easy question. It's not a slam dunk one way or the other.
Right.
But it is, you just can't throw it out because it's pretty early. And Papias is probably too removed from the apostles and writing within 30 to 40 years of when these gospels are written. So, I mean, that's pretty early. It's pretty good. You would look at things such as authors writing in the early 2nd century who mention the Gospels, and if they're writing in the early 2nd century, you say, well, it's got to be before then. And if they're writing these, mentioning, quoting from the Gospels as something that has been around for a while, then it goes back a little bit earlier, you know. So virtually all scholars, not 100%, but virtually all New Testament scholars, most of which are quite skeptical, place all 4 Gospels within the 1st century. And from there, it's hard to give them more precise dates. I mean, there are different arguments that are proposed, but even evangelical scholars like, say, an N.T. Wright, or a moderate like a Luke Timothy Johnson at Emory, or even some skeptical scholars will say, look, we go with the traditional dating of the Gospels, Mark at 65 to 70 AD, Matthew 80, Luke 85, John 90 to 95, but they admit, they say, look, those are pretty much arbitrary dates, and we really don't know, aside from saying the 1st century, that's when they were written.
Right. Are there other examples, though? I mean, the Gospels obviously get the most scrutiny. The New Testament books get the most scrutiny out there. But what about other historical figures or historical events? The histories that we have come to rely on, how close were they written to the actual person's life or the actual event that we're talking about?
Good question. Let's take, for example, Caesar Augustus. He was the greatest of all the Roman emperors. He was the emperor reigning at the time of Jesus' birth. Okay, the glories of Rome, the best days of Rome were under Augustus. And we have 8 chief sources in antiquity that tell us about Augustus. 2 of them were written during his youth. They cut off around the age 19 or 20. So that leaves us with 6 primary sources that tell us about Augustus, about his adulthood, which, you know, most people, that's what you're really interested in. And of those, the earliest is a short funerary inscription of under 4,000 words. That was probably written contemporaneous with Augustus' life, probably at the end of his life or shortly thereafter. Other than that, though, of the 6 chief sources that talk about his adulthood, the next one you have is Plutarch, who writes 90 years after his death. And then the other 4 that you have are written between 100 and 200 years after his death. So 6 primary sources, one's pretty contemporary with him. The other 5, however, plus 90, plus 100 to 200 years after Augustus' death. Now, when you say that is what historians have to work with the greatest of all the Roman emperors,
Right.
And 4 biographies written about Jesus within, according to the standard dating, 35 to 65 years of his death. That's pretty good.
Right. It just makes the point that if we're going to call into question the facts of the New Testament based on what Ehrman's saying, then we have to call into question many of the historical figures and events that we've come to just take as this is how they happened.
Absolutely. So. And you know what's interesting, he raises in his discussions, he'll say that, 65 years later, that's like reporting on World War II now. That's a long time. A lot of things can happen in between. Well, I got thinking about that and saying, well, okay, 65 years, that's the standard dating for John, 60 to 65 years. But when you're talking about the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, now Mark is written within 35 to 40 years later. And now we're talking not World War II, we're talking Vietnam. And really, Mike, if there were 3 Vietnam veterans, if we sat down 3 Vietnam veterans and said, hey, tell us about some combat missions you were involved in 1974, are we really to say that that's really too long, that nothing they said would be trustworthy? I mean, let's even take the 65 years with World War II. If Ehrman really believes that, then he needs to contact the History Channel and say, stop! No more sitting down these World War II veterans and talking with them. I mean, it's useless testimony. We don't want to watch any more of your documentaries.
Yeah.
But of course he doesn't believe that.
And sometimes some of the best information we don't get until years and years and years later, when people are ready to talk about it, or when the gravity of it has really sunk in. So it's almost just the opposite of losing something with age. Sometimes we gain something.
Well, that's true. And one other thing I'd point out too is it's not like in this 35 to 40 year period gap between the death of Jesus and the first gospel we have. And again, I'm taking the standard dating. If Matthew was an eyewitness writing in the 50s, well, then we're less than 20 years. So I'm just using the standard accepted, and again, it's arbitrary, but it's accepted by most scholars today. So even if we're taking the 35 to 40 years, that is not to say that we don't have things in between to fill in the gap, and that the first report we have was 35 to 40 years later by Mark. No, not at all. I mean, that's when the first written record we have, but you got Paul's letters that has some dozen certain allusions to the Jesus tradition, which was passed along very carefully, and you probably have echoes from another 30 or more, even 40 different sayings of Jesus from the tradition or Jesus tradition in there. So you can go back very close to the events itself. So that gap has been plugged in pretty well, a lot better than other things that we have in antiquity.
And like you said, that's just about the time things were actually written down. The oral passing down of the New Testament and the Gospels was also staying alive and taking place during this time. And that was a very carefully carried out tradition. It was something that was pretty reliable the way they did it.
Yes, it was. And I think Ehrman misses this. When he describes this tradition or the stories of Jesus being passed along, he describes it more like the game of telephone, that we all played as a kid, where you whisper in someone's ear, and by the time it gets to the back, you've got a different story or a couple different stories. And of course, if that can happen within a room over a 15-minute period, and what happens when you cross languages, cross cultures, and talk in 35 to 40 years before it gets put into writing. But I think that's inaccurate by and large on how these stories are passed along. I think a better example would be like the forms in the martial arts.